Welcome, everyone. My name's David Wood, and I chair London Futurists. Here's a question that's being raised a lot these days. When are things going to get back to normal? People are in various ways fatigued by the stresses and strains of the new behaviour patterns that have been adopted in response to the COVID pandemic. But at the same time as hankering for the old normal, the disruptions of the last 2 years have raised general awareness that, compared to before, there are different ways, better ways, in which society can and should operate. In this perspective, there's less of a desire to get back to the old normal and more of a desire to understand and then navigate towards what can be called a new normal, a next horizon, to use a phrase from the title of the book from Fast Future Publishing that we're going to be discussing today. Once we identify a potential desirable next horizon, our next task is to understand the forces we might encounter en route to that destination, the aftershocks that could throw us far off course if we're not careful. Collectively, we need to improve our ability to anticipate these aftershocks and to prepare to harness them, if that's possible, for positive good. That's a tough challenge because the landscape ahead is complicated in all kinds of ways. But the good news is that many different futurists, researchers, activists, and forecasters around the world are increasingly collaborating to share their different insights and perspectives. A very tangible output of this collaboration is the Fast Future book we're discussing today. To tell you more about it and to introduce some of the authors of chapters of that book, in a moment I'm going to hand over to the book's primary architect and lead editor, the CEO and founder of Fast Future, Rohit Talwar. But first, a quick word from me to the live audience on Zoom. If questions occur to you as you listen to the following conversations, please type them into the Q&A window, and you should find buttons below the screen to get into that window. And if you notice another question in that window that you think deserves to be raised as a priority, please give it a thumbs up vote. You can also place some comments into the text chat window at any time, but I advise you to keep listening carefully to the various speakers as you do so. You don't want to miss some of their key points. With that said, I'll now hand the virtual microphone to Rohit. Rohit, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, David, and thank you to everyone for joining this session, whether you're joining it live with us now or watching it afterwards. So I want to just tell you a little bit about the book, and I'm going to have some of the contributors also share their thoughts. So we have Claire, we have Alejandro, we have Jose with us. Unfortunately, Marion Salzman has had to pull out the last minute because she's now in a flight at the time we're presenting. And Doa Algabun had to drop out as well today, but she did kindly take the time to record us a little video. So you're going to hear from each of the panelists in the next few minutes. And I'll tell you a little bit about the book and then we'll get into more depth. So what I'll start by doing is just tell you a little bit of an overview about the book and where it came from, and then we can dive in to hearing from the panelists. So back in March of last year, when the pandemic really started to take hold, we decided that it would be useful to get futurists together to share their views as to what life could be like after the pandemic. And we were overwhelmed with responses. So we published the first book, snappily titled Aftershocks and Opportunities 1. And we published that in June of last year. And then there were so many really good chapters that we thought we would wait for a while and let the pandemic play out for a while and then bring out a second version. So the authors were very kind enough to create the first chapters and then update them. And so that's what came out on the 28th of September. Just to tell you a little bit about the book. As you say, there are contributors from all around the world, 5 continents represented. They come together in a series of chapters that are of varying lengths, but mainly pretty snappy. You can read most chapters in about 5 minutes. and really exploring scenarios, perspectives on the emerging future, stories of how things might play out, critical developments we need to think about, and game-changing ideas. And it's divided into 7 sections. So let me just tell you a little bit about those. The first looks at the economy and business, looks at the global landscape, looks at the rise of the crypto economy, also talks about how we bring foresight into business, how we evolve leadership, change management. And given the kind of aging population in many economies, we thought that retirement was a great topic to talk about at the economic level because it's so important to the shaping of the economy. Then we have a number of contributors looking at how the operating environment might play out. So whether that's scenarios for the world, potential for conflict and how that might play out, some of the societal implications and how individuals and organizations and nations navigate through that, and where some of the risks might emerge as we look ahead. We then have some very interesting chapters exploring regional and national futures. So how do some of the hardest hit regions and nations pull out of this and create a platform for genuine sustainable development and growth going forwards? Then a number of really good chapters around society and lifestyles, looking at generational issues, health, education, the long-term legacy of social distancing in the pandemic, and also some of the more dystopian possibilities as we created this surveillance society and given governments immense power. What could that look like and how might that play out? We then look at a number of sectors from insurance and education through to healthcare, travel, food, and sustainable agriculture. We have the 6th section looks at innovation and technology. So looks at the kind of opportunities that are coming out, how the digital transformation agenda may play out, the role of critical technologies in the metaverse, and how do we bring together technology and sustainability to really map a path to the future. And then we close with 3 future frameworks, where we're really trying to lay out some very practical tools for people. So the first looks at what are some of the big global opportunities and risks out there that we need to be mindful of across a range of different domains, 5 different domains. Secondly, we look at how over 400 technologies in 13 different categories could evolve in the near, medium, and longer term. And finally, we pull together 50 questions, drawing from all the different ideas in the book to really provide people with some challenges as they think about this for their lives, their organizations, and their nations, as they start to map out personal strategies, organizational strategies, and national policy. So that's a very quick run through of the overall structure of the book. I will just tell you now, and then we'll come back to it. Members of this forum can get a 25% discount on the book and all the other books in our bookstore, and I'll come back and reshare this slide at the end. So with that, I'm now going to just ask each of the panel members to take 30 seconds to introduce themselves. Let's start with you, Claire. Just 30 seconds to introduce yourself and who you are and what you do.
Good morning. I was the first Jamaican on the moon back in 2034 when I went up to set up Lunar Paxville. So I'm here from a resident at this current time, which is 2021, in DC metro area. I am Jamaican, as you would have recognized, and I practice as the Chief Ideation Leader of Nonprofit Research Corporation, the Futures Forum, doing sustainability engineering. I'm an engineer by training, so I'm pushing out that and focusing very much on how engineers can engineer the sustainable development goals and global sustainability. So that's my daily bailiwick. Thank you.
Excellent. Alejandro.
Hello, I'm Alejandro from Buenos Aires, Argentina. I'm working in future studies since 2012, and I work for the Argentinian Army, and I also have several startups on building the future. I like AI, IoT, and I work on that. So, and in the last year, I founded a think tank on future thinking called Extendidos, where we publish also a book called Designing Futures to Transform, to Change the Present. And well, thank you, Rohit, for sharing this space with us.
Okay, excellent. Jose, would you like to finish off
yes.
for the panelists?
Hello to everybody. I am Jose Cordeiro, originally from Venezuela, but now living in Madrid, Spain. I am an engineer also, like Claire, from MIT, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, working on emerging technologies. I was founding faculty of Singularity University. I am one of the directors of the Millennium Project. I am a fellow of the World Academy of Art and Science, and I am the vice chair of Humanity Plus. And I always try to see the future ahead and how technology will impact and improve the human condition.
Excellent. In the days when we used to send letters and we had letterheads, I think Jose's would have been the longest letterhead in the world with all his accreditations and achievements. And I'm so delighted to have this group with us. The way we're going to do this is each panelist is going to take a few minutes to talk about their particular chapter. We'll then have some questions about that chapter. And then we'll go into a broader discussion about the book and the questions that you from the audience have. And obviously, I hadn't introduced myself. I'm Rohit Talwar, CEO of Fast Future. Spend my time challenging governments and corporations to think differently about what might shape the future and how do we respond to what's changing, but also give ourselves permission to create the future. So I'm going to start with Alejandro, if I may. Alejandro, do you want to just take a few minutes to tell us about your chapter?
Sure. Yeah, I presented my chapter just thinking on scenarios in the short term, mid-term, and long term in the post-pandemic situation. We set the analysis by two big questions. Which things might change forever after the disruption of the pandemic? And how can we make smarter decisions today so we can be better prepared for tomorrow? With these two questions in mind, we analyze 4 facts that we are experiencing. One is, or the first is, the working from home. I mean, the emerging of this only way to keep operations up and running in the lockdown, and how this will remain in the future, or which impact will it have in the future. Also, the digitalizations of the business. Many business has to digitalize suddenly from one day to the other. The third is the cultural and societal impacts of social distancing and online meetings. And the third is the accelerated pace and scale of bankruptcy among small to medium sized business. With these things in mind, we set up a first scenario. We present the first scenario in the near future that is maybe a dark scenario with unemployment and inflation, where the government has to assist all the people that went out from the system because they couldn't work, they couldn't be free to walk around, and this impact is like, of course, at first, like very bad. Also, with the working from home thing and studying from home, moreover in Latin America or in emerging countries, that brought out a lack of communication infrastructure. So we are experiencing problems with the internet, with the communication, with 3G, 4G, or even 5G. On the upside, in the near future, we see business related with support on online operations, like are very positively impacted with this. So we see new unicorns on the digitalization area, on the tech area. On the midterm, what we present as a scenario is a new steady state, a physical state. This is a state where the physical world and the digital world meets and blends together. The impact of the working from home starts like being like well seen from the companies and for the corporations, because they are starting to see the benefits of that, like saving a lot of money on infrastructure, on services, and on all the things around of working people in a same building. So we see that the corporations and big companies start delivering their work in a physical world where their employees can do many things from home and they save a lot of money. Also, in this midterm scenario, we see that many unemployed people start becoming entrepreneurs. And in emerging countries such as Latin America, we will need to invest in communications infrastructure in order to support the amount of data traffic driven by the increase of people working from their home. Also, we think that in the really near future, probably next year or the other, we will start seeing many countries declaring the internet as a basic societal service, such as in Finland or in more developed countries. So in this midterm scenario, we see that all these unsteady things that happened during the pandemic start like gaining a steady state. And then in a long-term scenario, we think that some of these entrepreneurs that emerged during this pandemic will succeed. And as many entrepreneurs succeed, we will have much more companies in the world interacting, making the economy more decentralized and functioning in a mesh ecosystem. This transformation could increase the stability and the resilience of the economic system. So probably we will be much more prepared for the next pandemic that we hope it never happens. Also, because of the digitalization, this thing that we will be like around our homes, we will not travel a lot because we can work from home, we can study from home, we can be like near our houses. We think that people will commute much less, and this will impact in the shape of the cities. And this impact will be extremely positive because we will reduce commuting, we will decrease the carbon footprint, of course, and we will increase the amount of spare time for the people, because we will not lose many time in trains or buses going from one way from our homes to our shops. So if the corporations start like reducing their working spaces, also in the mid-long term scenario, we will see that the buildings might be repurposed to residential use, lowering maybe the price of the real estate, because now we have like big offices where hundreds of people goes only there for a couple of hours and then come back, and those won't be necessary anymore. So maybe these offices start like selling off the real estate and their places, and this should impact in the real estate price. And also,
Alejandro, so
yeah, sure,
Alejandro, should we just, do you want to take 30 seconds to wrap up? And
yeah, sure.
Time for
questions? The last thing that I think that it will be like really impact is the architecture of the family structures, because the dynamics will change, because we will be all together in the same house, in the same home, sharing the shops, sharing the studies, and reshaping the way that we see our houses. We will need to have a place for working, a place for studying, a place for living in the very same place.
Excellent, excellent. We're going to throw it open for a couple of questions for Alejandro, and I know David already has one. So David, why don't you jump in with your question.
So before anybody types a question into the Q&A, I want to ask Alejandro about this working from home and studying from home. As you point out, a lot will change if that trend continues. But how soon will we know? How soon will we be confident that things are not going back the same as before, that people won't be sucked back into the city centres? Because we've all got our kind of aspiration that it might be nicer if we weren't crammed on top of each other. But what's the data that can determine whether this is going to happen or not?
I think that, of course, we are not sure about the future, but I think that now that we're going out from the pandemic, we see many companies already letting their employees working from home. And I believe that the pandemic put or show us what things really need to be physical and what things could be digital. So I believe that there will be a blend of physical and digital way of working. Maybe we will have to go or we'll have to have an office, but it won't be like necessary or obligatory to go there. So I believe that it's already happening.
Just before we go on, I want to say I'm an old man, and therefore I can't monitor both the chat and the Q&A box. So if you have questions for any of the panel members, please put them in the Q&A box. If you're having general discussion, that's fine, just keep it going in the chat. I have a question for you, Alejandro. One of the points you make in the chapter is that the pandemic has in many cases been quite devastating for small to medium enterprises around the world. And they've suffered disproportionately in many cases because they don't have the resources to see it through. What's your view on what we can do both in developing economies and more developed nations to really support the regeneration of that startup ecosystem and that SME ecosystem?
Well, I believe that the people who has startup mind will survive. I mean, when the economy will be steady again, that is happening already. The people who look forward and who has this startup courage will survive anyways. Given this, I think that governments should help maybe with lowering taxes, with facilitating the new startups to build up. I believe that probably in developed countries, it will be much easier than in developing countries such as Argentina or Latin America. But I think that there are small shops that are easy to generate. Maybe I think that the worst impact will be like in the middle of the pyramid, because small shops, you just open a new shop and that's okay. Big companies are still big, but to produce this middle tier of companies will be much harder because it takes time to develop this kind of companies and this kind of business.
Excellent, thank you. Well, we're going to have more time to discuss with Alejandro and the whole panel a little bit later. And I've seen a really good question come in about inequality, which I think is a good one for open conversation later. So thank you, Alejandro. We're now going to move on and talk to Dr. Claire Nelson. Claire, you wrote an excellent chapter around how we can really regenerate some of the hardest hit regions. So please take 4 or 5 minutes to tell us about some of the key ideas in your chapter, which was a wonderful tour of imagination and has had many really positive comments since we published.
Yeah, thank you so much, so much. I really enjoyed putting my fingers to the wheel. I have to say, the impetus for this chapter came from the total outrage that many of us of African descent felt in response to the comment by some French guy about, oh, we can test the vaccines in Africa. That was the impetus for my response. I thought, here we go again. Africa, the dumping grounds, everybody just comes and, excretes their waste in Africa, mentally, emotionally, spiritually, and this is enough. But what if we see this moment as a pregnant pause? I really see this whole COVIDemic, and that's my word for it, the COVID pandemic is called a COVIDemic. We Jamaicans like to make up words, right? So this COVIDemic as a moment of pregnant pause. We're being asked to think about which direction humanity could take. And it's the first time really, I think, that those of us who have been talking about planetary consciousness got to really experience what it could be like with the internet brain and us all plugged in at one level or the other. And so with that in mind, with the COVID pandemic, and then at about the same time when this came up, there was the George Floyd murder. And then again, we see a whole Pan-African uprising. And what was interesting about this Pan-African uprising was that we saw a lot of the Generation X and millennials get involved as allies, marching in the streets of New York and Austin and London and Paris. And it was really a different sensibility around, seeing a lot of white people carrying these signs, Black Lives Matter. And I think that response was partly, in large part, due to this feeling that is out there, not yet harnessed, that we have to find a better way if we're to survive as a species. So I thought about, what if I could put together this consciousness around, okay, Pan-African consciousness rising, and then the AU having its 2063 vision as a fact, and the AU also having a policy clause that says the African diaspora should be considered a sixth constituency of Africa, and moving this idea that remittances, which is well over $500-something billion, should really not just be about the money, but should also be about intellectual, technical, and other capacities that the African diaspora, the Caribbean diaspora, the Pacific diaspora has in the global north, from Finland to Australia. We're everywhere, and doing science, technology, and all these things. What I found just before I started writing also was that here in the United States, quite a few Africans were involved in trying to create telehealth solutions. Quite a few of them were trying to figure out lab kits for rural Africa and had designed these things, but had no money to finance them. So I did a series of what if all of this hope and aspiration could really be financed with some of this money, and what if we could move away from, okay, all the solutions for healthcare should only come from the big pharmaceuticals, but there really was investment in some of the nutraceuticals being tested in Africa, because I knew about some of the people doing these things as well. And then I started thinking about, well, what if we don't have to wait for the big financing to do, but we could use crowdfunding to do these things. So hence the Ubuntu Economic Agenda was born, and the Ubuntu Economic Alliance was born in full force. I have to say, these ideas have been floating in my mind for some time, having spoken to some South Africans about how they might reconstitute the housing challenge that they're facing, affordable housing. So I said, well, I've been talking about this, I might as well put it into action. So I'm a great believer in what you write becomes a reality. And so therefore, I decided to do what I normally do. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was made flesh. I write it with the hope that this will somehow take up life and become a reality. So my chapter is really a scenario from the year 2027, and talking about how the smart futures paradigm, which again was also in a book I was writing at the time, would inform this uprising of the African diaspora, the Caribbean diaspora, Pacific diaspora, not with one accord. I don't believe in one accord, but with one lens in which to address the policy and engineering decisions that they had to make. And so we have invented and used the old agreements and alignments of ACP around civil society and government policies, and we have reinvented the ACP to a couple countries, right? Which is the African and Caribbean Alliance and Pacific Alliance, and really use that as well as this Pan-African consciousness and the ability now to shame the African billionaire boys and women and girls, there are quite a couple of them out there, into doing the right thing. And this to me worked because there was a hint that the African billionaires were willing to invest some money in treating the research around public health in Africa. So these were some of the insightful moments I used to get my story out.
Claire, thank you. And I really would encourage people to read that chapter. The questions we got coming in so far are quite general. So if I may, I'll start with a question for you. That one of the things you talk about is creating these parallel or new institutions to work alongside the existing ones. What do you think is required in terms of a mindset change within the existing institutions and even the kind of most powerful donor nations and support nations? What kind of mindset change do we need towards the ACAPA countries in order to create the kinds of platforms you talk about, the education solutions you talk about, the collaborations between universities that you talk about? What kind of mindset change do we need in the rest of the world to enable that?
I think the most important mindset change, and I speak this from personal experience, is the reduction of the paternalistic view that we know what's best for everyone, and recognize that in every society there are agents and there's agency that is quite a level of genius that can work, and that when informed by and brought together with what's, let's say, in the global north, we can have a better solution. So I would like to see more people working in the World Banks and the IDBs and the African Development Banks of this world have a system thinking mindset, right? We have a big challenge. First of all, most of them don't understand future thinking. I know this because I've lived it. And if you are not of the male and pale persuasion, typical in these institutions like I was, you get any of your ideas get shunted to the side as crazy, would never work. There's not the intelligent discussion and what I say, curt, respectful critique of ideas that come from people who don't fit the stereotype of who has the best ideas. So I would say paternalism to be reduced, sexism to be reduced, and internal racism in these organizations would go a far way to helping us get better solutions so that those people already in those institutions, working in those institutions, could have more room to breathe. And I'm really hoping that the hubris that many of the management class of these institutions have towards their work as missionaries to save the world can be sort of toned down in the respectful notion that, you know what, we're all in the same boat here and we're all struggling to find answers for what David Wood started out saying is a very complicated and not only complicated, but complex as well, systems of systems challenge that we need to address.
Great. We've got another question come in actually in relation to what you just talked about from Annette Moore. And she says, do you think that local oligarchy has a more positive role than the global oligarchy and that it has so far received unfair treatment within global competition? What's your sense of that?
I think local oligarchies, be they be in the small Jamaicas of this world or the Venezuelans of this world or Nigerians of this world, are sometimes equally, how can we say this now? I don't know the right word, are equally dastardly demons, if you ask me, right? I've been saying to my friends, I'm also a diaspora organizer. So I've been saying to them, we need to stop with this sending home of barrels of books and barrels of healthcare things. And let us build an app, for example, that allows the young people on a smartphone to out these people, and make sure it is offshore so they can't be traced back to these young people in any way. But we need to find ways, new ways of dealing with some of the, sort of a disrespect even of the oligarchies have for the local people. And so I don't spare anybody. I don't give anybody a pass on this one. Everybody is equally under my eagle eye of who needs to be treated with us with the same level of contempt that they treat the people that their companies and their organizations are supposed to serve.
Excellent. Thank you, Claire. And we're going to come back to you. I'm sure it's triggered a lot of thoughts and energy amongst the audience. And I've got about 19 other questions I want to ask as well. But we're going to move on to Jose Cordero. Many of you will know that Jose has been very passionate about this idea for some years now, that within crisis also lies opportunity. And it feels like the last 18 months have been a perfect time to really demonstrate that. So I'm going to ask Jose to take again 4 or 5 minutes to tell us about some of the key ideas in his chapter, and then we'll open it up again for a broader conversation.
Yes, Rohit, thank you so much for the opportunity to contribute in this interesting book, because indeed, I believe every crisis is an opportunity. And it is not just me who believes that. Many people, including the Chinese, and the word crisis in Chinese has 2 characters. The first one is danger, and the second one is opportunity. So let me show that quickly, because I think it really is interesting to see the Chinese character for people who understand Chinese. I hope you can see the Chinese character, right? So first, I lived 3 years in Japan, and I learned some Chinese characters, but first I wrote it upside down sometimes. I didn't know how to do it well, so I learned how to do it. I took calligraphy courses, and I learned how to do it also sideways, but the real way is this. In Chinese, and then in Japanese, in Korean, when they use Chinese characters, in Vietnamese, when they use Chinese characters, they have this very important word that is represented by danger and opportunity. So there is always, as I like to say, the yin yang. And this yin yang is so complex that there is little yin yang inside, and even more little yin yang. But again, every crisis is an opportunity. The Chinese also have a fantastic saying that let's light up the world. Don't blame darkness. Let's light up a candle. And I believe that. And now in this crisis, we have 2 possibilities. If you look at the world at night, you can see the Korean Peninsula, which is divided, and there are 2 Koreas. South Korea actually has probably the best internet in the world today. The best internet. And North Korea is the last country in the world still without public internet. And it is the same Korean people. They were a single country until the war, but then South Korea has moved forward into the future, and North Korea has stayed behind in the past. I am also happy that my book about the opportunities on longevity with my co-author, David Wood, just came out in Chinese, and it's going to keep on coming in different languages to talk about the opportunities of this crisis of COVID, because now, thanks to COVID, we are discovering that the biggest crisis is health. Healthcare actually is not healthcare today, it is sick care. And we have to move from sick care into health care, knowing that aging is the center of most diseases. And if we stop aging, we can cure basically many other diseases. So we have to focus on aging as one of the problems of the future. In our book, well, in this chapter specifically, we also talk about pandemics. We have had many pandemics in human history. And this is a very small pandemic, actually, a small pandemic throughout human history. It has killed maybe 5, even if it is eventually 10 million, which is a tragedy. And I do not want to diminish this at all. This is a human tragedy. But 100 years ago, the Spanish flu, which was not Spanish, by the way, killed about 100 million people. It is estimated in 3 years, 100 million people, and the population of the planet at the time was only 2 billion people. So the Spanish flu was a much bigger crisis, and we were not prepared. We did not have the technology. We did not have vaccines for it. So it only died out itself after 3 years of killing 100 million people. If we go farther back in time, other pandemics also were horrible, like the Black Death the bubonic plague in Europe, that it is estimated that killed 1 out of 3 Europeans at the worst time. 1 out of 3 Europeans, a really horrible pandemic. Nonetheless, there were opportunities. And actually, one of these pandemics helped the start of the Renaissance. And the Renaissance in Italy began partly because of this Black Death. And many writings, many scientific achievements came from that time, like including the Decameron. Boccaccio wrote the Decameron during the Black Death. And in another pandemic later on, even in England, Isaac Newton worked on the laws of motion of the universe during another pandemic. So we have to use this crisis into opportunities. Alejandro talked about some of the incredible things that are happening because of the pandemic. We are finally having the digital transformation of health, education, finance, transportation, manufacturing, government, and many, many other things, which were estimated to take maybe 1 decade, 2 decades, or even longer, and they have been accelerated because of this horrible pandemic. But medicine has advanced also very much, and I think we need to look at this very optimistically. The COVID-19 virus was sequenced in 2 weeks in China, in just 2 weeks, and it was sent via email to some research centers in Europe and in North America.
Jose, can you take about 30 seconds to just wrap up so that we can get some time for questions for you as well? Thank you.
Yes. Well, the point again is that everything is accelerating because of the pandemic, and also medicine health. And the point, and as I was mentioning, is the vaccine was, well, the virus was sequenced in 2 weeks, and the first vaccines were developed in just 2 days. This is incredible. People thought it would take a decade, but it took 2 weeks to sequence the virus and 2 days to develop the first vaccines. So incredible advances in health, medicine, thanks to this tragedy of COVID, which I repeat is a small pandemic. And the final point here, I am so optimistic about the future and the advances thanks to exponential technologies that I think this will be the last pandemic in human history. There will be no other pandemic at all in 5 or 10 years, because we will be ready in days, maybe in hours, to stop the next pandemic.
Thank you, Jose. So we've got a first question in here from Martin Bielecki. He says, does yin-yang also symbolize dualistic thinking? And do you think it is possible to go beyond dualistic thinking, good, bad, black, white, in a collective manner?
Very good question. And I wish I knew more Chinese and I was more of a philosopher, because these questions are not so much for an engineer from South America. But yes, obviously there is a dualistic mentality and a dualistic approach for many things. And actually there might be more, much more. And I am not an expert on it, but what we really need to think again is that every problem is also an opportunity, and we need to see the bad things, the good things, and to try to create the future we want. We need to learn all the possibilities and go for the best and avoiding the worst. And maybe not in a dualistic fashion now, but in the future, we will have maybe 3 dimensions, 4 dimensions, 5 dimensions. We don't know, but this is getting increasingly interesting, exponentially exciting.
Okay, excellent. One of the things that's an implication of everything you say is that, again, we really need at the top level in government in particular, this shift in belief and this ambition to go for the kinds of radical changes we've seen happening in the pandemic, in our behaviors. Where are you most inspired by as you look around the world, by governments that are really seizing that radical agenda?
Actually, I think we have seen many different experiences. many different governments, and also social society itself, how social society and individuals have approached this COVID crisis. And I believe in competition, because competition lets us compare different approaches. I was just in Sweden 2 weeks ago, and then I am now in Germany, and the week before in Switzerland, and totally different approach to what happened in Spain with a complete lockdown, or in Latin America. So I really think we need to learn from these experiences, and competition and comparing afterwards is important. Also comparing technologies. And I want to emphasize, because the first vaccines were developed in 2 days, but there were different labs working on different technologies, like the Pfizer, which is BioNTech from Germany, and the Moderna vaccine from the USA, that used one fantastic new technology called messenger RNA. This new technology now is being used to create vaccines for 3 of the worst killers in humanity, much worse than COVID, and they are malaria, cancer, and even AIDS, HIV virus. This is absolutely incredible, and it is happening because of competition of technologies, competition of governments, competition of countries. So I think we need competition to learn from the best.
Thank you, Jose. Thank you. Before we go on to share Doa's video, I just want to talk a little bit about some of our chapters. So we contributed 5 chapters into the book, but the 2 that I really want to focus on are around the crypto economy, because we see this as something that has really risen to prominence during the pandemic. We've gone from a global market capitalization of about 196 billion at the start of 2020 to around 196 billion to around 2.7 trillion today. Now, opinions are very divided. At one level, people talk about it being a scam, the crypto economy being a platform for drug dealers and the dark economy, no regulation, potential for rug pulls and all sorts of bad behavior. On the other hand, the people who kind of initiated this with the launch of Bitcoin really saw this as a way of changing the way economies are run. So rather than having the capacity of governments to print as much money as you want, they basically said that Bitcoin would have 21 million maximum coins available down to 18 decimal places, so down to 1 quintillionth of a Bitcoin. And basically you had a rules-based system where the system effectively answered to its own code. And so you've seen a number of different ways in which it's played out, with the people with a very democratic, egalitarian view of how things play out, and on the other hand, those who really just see this as another way of making money. But the marketplace has also attracted incredible amounts of top talent. So what we see now is that, yes, Bitcoin's the fastest growing or the best performing financial asset in history. We've seen the fastest rate of adoption of any technology in history, with over 300 million users now and a projected billion by 2024. And that market cap expected to rise to 200 trillion by 2030. Global stock market today is about 100 trillion. So it's putting this in context. And what we're seeing, and we talk about in the book, is a whole range of different asset classes, from, if you like, transactional currencies that are legal tender, through to things like Bitcoin, which has started that way, but has now effectively become digital gold, a store of value. And Bank of America concluded that the reason the price of Bitcoin was going up was because the price of Bitcoin was going up, and you see people moving out of gold and into Bitcoin. But then a whole range of different applications, from decentralized finance to supply chain management and the creation of NFTs. The interesting thing, I think, now is how the corporate world has come in, and we're seeing big financial institutions putting money in. We're seeing the creation of exchange traded funds, and now a growing number of corporates putting crypto on their balance sheet, like Tesla. Tesla now makes more money out of its crypto holdings than anything else it does. So we're seeing the nature of the market change. And this last week, in this last month, we've seen 2 different things happen. One was El Salvador adopted Bitcoin as legal tender on the 7th of September. And that's acted as a catalyst for a number of other countries. Over 40 are looking at doing that now. The other is that this week, MasterCard announced that every bank and every merchant it deals with, so millions of merchants around the world, could now accept Bitcoin and crypto and trade in crypto. And what that means is you don't have to be a genius to work out how these platforms work. And so we could see a very rapid adoption and evolution. The regulators are going to have to catch up with this quite rapidly. At the moment, none of them really know what to do. In the US, there's a fight between the various agencies who control currency versus control securities and derivatives, saying, well, which of us should govern this? And at the same time, they're doing test cases against various crypto ventures to see how they can control the marketplace. Perhaps the most interesting development, though, that I think that could have the biggest societal impact is this idea of tokenization and fractionalization. So because you can buy a Bitcoin down to 18 decimal places, and it's all done in a fully automated manner using these decentralized autonomous organizations, it's opening up the possibility for some very radical changes in how we do things in society. So, for example, imagine tokenizing a home. Imagine you were buying a home for $100,000. We could turn that into 10 million 1-cent tokens. I might buy 20% as with my cash, take a mortgage on 20%, but the other 60% could be made available to anyone to purchase tokens in that property. And what that means is they don't have to wait for me to sell my property. They can sell their tokens in the open market at any time and cash in if the value of the property is increasing. Equally, if I want to take some cash out of my property, I don't have to go through complex and expensive equity release programs. I just sell a few tokens. And many people are seeing this as a real democratizing moment, a real moment of creating equality, or a greater equality and access, because if I could never have got onto the property ladder before, I can now put any amount of savings I've got into another property, watch it appreciate, and gradually build up the money to play. So we think the crypto marketplace is going to evolve. There's going to be lots of challenges, but we think we're at a very interesting tipping point now, and the next year to two could really see that market evolve and take shape and, you know, in a sense, create the basis of a new internet. So that's just that one. And again, I'll take any questions on that later. But what I want to do now is to share Doa's video.
Don't you want to answer a quick question from Claire about crypto?
Oh, yeah, sure, Claire. Have you got a question? I didn't see it.
It's gone into the chat.
Yes.
Such a rule breaker.
Sorry. I just want to say, as an engineer, I'm a little bit stressed out about this lemming-like approach to cryptocurrency. I just want to remind people that it runs off of electricity, right? Computers run off of energy. So my question is, has anybody answered the question I've been asking? What happens if the power gets pulled on the servers? Where does your money go?
Well, it's a very good question. And equally, we could ask that question of what happens to the running of the taxation system, the running of existing financial systems. Everything runs on electricity. So if the electricity goes down, it's not just the crypto economy, which is tiny compared to quadrillions in derivatives, a couple of $100 billion in bonds, couple of hundred trillion in bonds, 100 trillion in equities. So everything gets disrupted. There is an issue that people are saying around the energy consumption about one particular model for validating crypto transactions by the so-called miners, which is called proof of work. That is very expensive in energy, but what you're seeing is more and more of them moving to sources of renewable energy and also places where there's a lot of waste energy, because energy isn't something you can store forever. You generate it, it gets wasted. So a lot of moving to those locations. And we will see smarter and smarter models for how you validate transactions coming through that require a lot less energy. So platforms like Cardano now reckon they use 1% of the energy used by Bitcoin to validate a transaction. So energy is a big issue, but I think it's not as big as we think. And we actually use more energy to run air conditioning in the world than we do to run the crypto economy. So it's an interesting topic to explore. But with that, I am going to give Doa her video to, or air her video, and then we can talk more about that. So let's go.
So in fact, this current crisis has surfaced a number of critical fragility at all levels, such as individual, social, national, and international. And I was wondering really how political people will be reviewing their, let us say, current or outdated agenda to enhance the trust of the public. It's an overwhelming situation in general. Therefore, in this chapter, I try to examine the issues emerged during the response and recovery stages for the pandemic, and provide some insights into how these factors might come together to shape the possible future over the coming 5 years. I articulated expected political changes and associated economical impact, and how this could influence our social life. I discussed about 5 quick political scenarios, starting in how pandemic has handed the government extra power and that they would never normally acquire. Some of the government exercise let us say, more control and thereby undermining the people's freedom. Others was more flexible and became more transparent and open to their citizens, where they discussed their governance process. In both cases, we will project a big impact on the directional of handling either domestic or foreign policy. Second scenario that is being discussed is about to what extent the public less trust affected in longer term due to fragility of the crisis management and health care system. Third scenario was talking about the uncertainty of the global geopolitical system, where it is you discover the need of having a new global system to be emerged and the change in the power to move to eastwards. This possibility is supported by the faster economical recovery that resulted from the general better response and control of eastward countries. Scenario number 4 is discussing the born of new alliances due to the lack of the trust of the American leadership. Particularly given the growing influence of the Eastern powers, such as China, who is potentially, let us say, could replace the US as a main sponsor of the post-pandemic globalized economy and becoming or have bigger role in a global order by helping or rebuilding their countries and becoming more stronger in a global trade partnership. I think the last scenario that I discussed is about the reorientation of the public relationship between the government and public. I think patriotism as a meaning is not anymore dominated by the soldier who is defending the country during the war. It's as well the doctor and nurses who sacrifice their lives to serve others. Also, I've been seeing a big, let us say, decline in polarization concept, because we are not only, let us say, fighting several enemies. Now we all, as a world, fighting a common enemy. From the social economical perspective, I also articulated about 5 to 6 scenarios, starting with having extra focus for the mental health issues and coping mechanism, especially for the children and women who became more vulnerable and get an greatest impact to cope with unpredictable world changes during the crisis and the consequences of unemployment and physical and the increase of psychological problems. Also, I give more attention to essential worker, who is becoming like the most important, let us say, factor actors to ensure the continuity of the supply chain. As you all know, during the pandemic, the disturbance of the global supply chain and international trade was severe. So accordingly, I expect the government could invest more on, let us say, technologies and artificial intelligence to ensure the development of automated supply chain. Scenario number 3, I think I could expect that many governments is increasing the level of their social welfare benefit and create more different policies to secure the rights of essential workers, or for example, issuing the policies related to universal basic income. I predicted a continual decline in the consumer spending from Europe or US, which expected to reduce the consumer goods from the developing country, and vice versa. This consequently will affect the economy of these, let us say, developing country and make the situation more worse. Another scenario that is being discussed is like increase the level of the debts due to survive and recover from the pandemic, and this likely to impact the severity of several governments. This could increase also the potential for a greater political control by the donor nation and institution. The last scenarios discussed is about how we could see more international economical and political conflict due to the rise in the countries adopting a nationalist response and focus on that financial resources internally to ensure the domestic recovery and self-sufficiency. To sum up, really, the crisis has challenged and potentially changed the existing global systematic framework of the institutions, alliances, policies, and relationships. Adopting a positive way forward requires nations to come together in a newly formulated partnership rather than pursuing the current trend toward the narrow nationalist perspective. The pandemic has also potential to shift us toward a new version of power, not only export American democratic principles or economical models and social values. Now we consider the Eastern power, which is prepared to assume a positive or a greater authority and influence, but potentially we expect less social freedom. At the end, whatever governance model will be adopted in the world of a consistent change, we are expecting people to value this time, the physical and social and caring relationship more than the virtual interaction. Thank you and have a good day.
Okay, so we've had a very broad perspective there from Dara, covering quite a range of topics. I'm now going to throw it open to take some of the questions from the floor, and I'll start with the first 2 that we've got, and I'll ask a couple of the panelists to take each one. I won't ask everyone to answer everyone. So we have the first one from PNJ, and they say, a general question: how will the inequalities between and within nations be magnified by the pandemic? Those inequalities that have been magnified by the pandemic, how will they be addressed? Let's start with you, Alejandro. What's your view on that?
I believe that the inequalities will be like, or are being shown, but not specifically by the countries, but by the way that countries think. I think that there is a very different ways of liberal, I mean, the countries which we live in freedom, and the countries we are more like Argentina, Venezuela, or things like that, that they don't believe in this kind of way of free. In the countries like Argentina, Venezuela, Iran, or these particular countries with this kind of politics, we detach from the world, and we will be like way behind because they believe that everything must be done by the government and people cannot be free to think and to progress. Maybe Europe, the US, or even Brazil, that they believe in freedom, they probably will be much, how to say, they will be, they will recover much faster than us. That's my point of view. I don't believe that it's a question of countries, it's a question of governments, and maybe that's my answer.
Excellent. Claire, inequality, what happens?
Inequality, I think that, again, it stems back to the countries being willing to relook at the rule book. I was asked to speak to the central bank, a meeting of central banks last year. And the question they were asking is, how can central banks be more mindful of the impact of the decisions on the people at the bottom of the pyramid? And I do think that my response was, look at the metrics that you're using to measure success. And there might be a need to move to this issue of well-being. And I think this might be an opportunity for a global shift from the GDP as the main arbiter of what a successful nation looks like, to the metric like well-being. And the fact that the central banks were asking that question of somebody like me, who's not an economist, was, into myself, a sign that they are willing to listen to make a few changes. At least I hope that's what it meant.
Thank you. Thank you. Great. Our next question I'm going to put to Jose and David, because I think this is very much your bailiwick. We have a question from Martin Bielecki, and he's basically asking the question that, with a number of people getting very proud almost about the idea of using emerging technologies to enhance themselves and develop almost demigod status around how healthy and advanced and having advanced capabilities in the future, is there a risk that this increases inequality, particularly in terms of access to these transformative technologies? Let's start with you, David. We haven't heard from you yet.
Well, I think this is a great question, and it actually dovetails with what was being discussed a moment ago by Alejandro and by Claire. There are certainly opportunities for technology to solve diseases as never before. The remarkable quick development of mRNA vaccines, which could now be applied in the worlds of cancer and malaria and AIDS, as Jose has mentioned. That's encouraging. But equally, there are risks of some of the companies behind these technologies becoming the most wealthy companies ever. I remember it was a couple of years ago, we were all astonished. Gosh, one company, Apple, has reached the astonishing valuation of $1 trillion. Who would have guessed it? But now it seems to be every week another company reaches $1 trillion valuation. And they're all high-tech companies, and their great valuation is because they have control of technology platforms which underpin almost everything else. So there is a risk, I think, if we're not careful, if we take our eye off it, that we will have some of the most powerful companies ever in the world who are gaining their power in part by traditional IT, in part because they're providing IT for healthcare as never before. So it's not just a matter of inequalities within countries or inequalities between countries, it's inequalities between the people who are part of these super large corporations, Google, Alphabet, Facebook, Meta, possibly also Tesla, Microsoft, Apple, and so on, and the rest of us. And I think we need to pay attention to that as a possible threat, because one thing that happens is that people are aware of that, and it makes them distrustful. And even if the likelihood is that it will be well managed, so many people are nervous. I mean, Claire, I made a fascinating point earlier that people in Africa had understandably reacted strongly against any suggestion that Africans should be the testing ground for new vaccines. And why was there such a bad reaction? It's because in the past there has been inequalities in access to healthcare, and there were these trials. So I see this as an issue that deserves attention. If we manage it well, we should cope with it. But if we take our eyes off the ball, we can see more and more people feeling they're left behind and generating trouble and distress for the global psyche.
Excellent, thank you. Jose. is the quest for human augmentation to turn ourselves into humanity plus, is it creating the risk of greater inequality?
I believe that technology is not good or bad by itself. It depends on what we humans do with technology. One of the first examples of technology is fire. Fire can be used to cook and to warm up people, but also to burn and destroy. The same with nuclear energy. Nuclear energy can be used to generate electricity very cheaply or to make nuclear bombs. So technology by itself is not the issue. The issue is what we humans do. And therefore, I think we need to consider what we do with all these technologies. But also, we need to think that technology begins always very expensive and very bad. And when it is democratized, it becomes very good and very cheap. One example is mobile telephones, for example. They were incredibly expensive and incredibly bad when they began. And today, mobile phones are everything but just a phone, and they are very cheap. People in Africa, in India, in most of the world today, if they want, they have a mobile phone. The same with the vaccines, and the same with other medical treatments. They begin expensive and bad, but when they are massified, when they are democratized, they become good and inexpensive, and they will be available to every person who wants them. So I am very optimistic about technology getting cheaper and better, faster and smaller, but we need to have ethical considerations that we humans have to think about that. And also artificial intelligence, because artificial intelligence will be one of the most powerful technologies ever developed. It is so powerful that Vladimir Putin in Russia said that whoever controls artificial intelligence will control the world. And a few months later, the leader of China, whoever controls artificial intelligence will rule the world. So AI is very important, but it will be everywhere. Like electricity today, artificial intelligence will be in all devices very soon, and will help also to disseminate, to democratize other technologies that will become cheaper and cheaper. But the risk is always there, absolutely. In terms of artificial intelligence, I like to say I am not afraid of artificial intelligence, but I am afraid, very afraid of human stupidity. And that is the problem, human stupidity, not so much technology.
Excellent, excellent. I'm now going to combine two tech questions that we've got from Annette Moore and PNJ. And so basically the theme that both of them have is around this idea that on the one hand, governments are and regulators are struggling to keep up with the pace of technology advancement, yet they're handing over more and more responsibility to corporations for the running of our world. The corporations like Facebook have demonstrated themselves to be singularly incapable of protecting society in things like hate speech and online bullying and those kinds of things. And so the question is, how do we regulate? How do we change the rules governing corporates so that we protect society and give greater weight to the rights of human beings? Who wants to go first on that? Let's make this really democratic, but I will give you all the opportunity to comment on this around the advancement of technology, the regulation of technology, the protection of the citizen. Who wants to jump in first? Alejandro?
Well, I'm not very fan of regulations, so my answer maybe is let the market regulate the things, but I really believe that it's a big risk when very popular platforms start playing as the government. So I don't like regulations, but I don't like centralization, and I think that decentralization is the big risk. Also, I think that when private companies like Facebook or Meta or whatever start making bad things, and people realize they are in a big risk of people running out of the platform. And today the market value is billions or trillions, and tomorrow it could be zero. So they have to be very careful about what they do. And it's not the same with the government, because the government has 4 years and the elections, and so I don't believe in regulations. I think that people and the distributed intelligence should regulate the way that corporations act.
Jose.
I agree, also because I grew up in Venezuela, like Alejandro in Argentina. We are very skeptical of some governments and some regulations. That is also why I mentioned that I believe in competition and I believe in markets, especially now, because these technologies are changing so fast and the governments are so slow, so bureaucratic, that we cannot really just trust in governments for many of these new technologies. We need new forms of governance, where it is maybe governments, obviously, but also companies and social society. There are many NGOs that are doing many more things for humanity than governments. For example, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation is doing incredible things to control malaria that governments never did before, or even the United Nations didn't do. So markets and competition are important to the future.
Claire, I sense you've got an itch you want to scratch here.
Yes, I definitely have an itch I want to scratch here. I'm on the opposite side of the fence. We said something, Jose. AI is the nuclear bomb of the future. We're talking about generalized AI, where the singularity that you like to talk about. We're talking about a totally new, what they call it, intelligence that may or may not be in our control. I like to say that we have this idea of Zaptic futures. I use the word Zaptic. Technology is plump and luscious, and everybody's just trying to adore that body, and it's a Zaptic idea. And it's kind of down a very dangerous path. And so we're focusing on the implantation of things first, and instruments which are magnetic and electronic, as opposed to amplifying our exoconsciousness, the intuitions and other things of which humans are capable already. We notice they've been using them in wars, etc., to do remote sensing and those things. We're focusing less on enhancing those abilities so we can transcend our humanity in the flesh towards using machines which are man-made to help us transcend our limitations in the flesh. I have spoken recently on 3 AI things in the last, from May until now. And I come out on the side that says we need to have a global rule book around how AI is used. We need to have a global rule book in which everybody has a seat at the table. We already see the dangers of AI in how it impacts elections, deep fakes, and those things. So I don't want to hear about technology is neutral, because humanity, unfortunately, we are not neutral. We're still operating from our lizard brains, in which we operate as if to say, winner takes all, and to hell with the rest of everybody else. So until we get to this kumbaya moment, which is nowhere in the near future, we need to have rule of law that guarantees that people have their freedoms, the right to be invisible, the right to be private, while at the same time benefit from the wondrous things we have created with our fantastic genius, which allows us to tap into everybody and track down pedophiles and all other people we do want to watch and catch, while ensuring that the 6 mega companies that control our data don't morph into something that is equally monstrous as as the Tower of Babel was in the age of Gilgamesh or whatever. So that's my take on AI. We want zoetic futures, not Zavtic futures.
Excellent. David, do you want to come in on this one?
Well, I think we're reaching what's known as Kranzberg's third law, named after Melvin Kranzberg, who said technology is not positive, technology is not negative, but neither is it neutral. It will have unpredictable consequences. And that's why we need to be ready to apply some regulations to it. If we didn't regulate the spread of nuclear weapons technology with careful non-proliferation treaties and enforcement, we could have been in a much worse world today if the Al-Qaeda had fulfilled their wish of getting hold of such materials. But it's true, regulations make a mess. It's true, most government regulations are outdated. But we can't say regulations have failed, therefore let's give up. We have to say, let's do them better. It's the same with the market. Free markets have had terrible failures. Pursuit of GDP has led companies into things which are not good for human flourishing. But we shouldn't overreact and say, well, let's ban markets. We just need to say, let's steer markets better. So my view is we should look at examples of good regulation that has worked. And a lot of the improvement in lifespan, there's a lovely book by Stephen Johnson, A Short History of Living Longer. It's also a series that's available online. He points out that some of the improvements in our life expectancy were due to vaccinations and antibiotics, but a lot were also due to enforced cleanliness of water, enforced pasteurization of milk, going against what some of the local markets wanted to do. And so when public government stepped in at the local or state levels, it boosted health, and they mandated vaccines in a way that actually also helped a lot. So let's be smarter in regulations. It's not easy. It's going to require a lot of very skillful people to do it in the agile and lean way, but we can't turn our backs from it.
I'm going to wrap this up because we're getting towards the end, but I would agree a lot with what Claire and David said. And I think that what's interesting is the perception to me is that the bigger the market, the greater the potential for market abuse, and the more we've seen that happen. So, financial services is a classic example versus the food industry, where we have a lot less failures, a lot less market abuse, or something in the healthcare, as you say, some of the utilities. The concern for me right now is with Facebook's announcement that it's rebranding as Meta and that it wants to become this multiverse in which all the other metaverses and virtual worlds exist and become the kind of Uber platform for everything. I fear the potential for abuse there, and for them to say, hold their hands up and say, well, we just can't control people. When someone's created a dragon as their persona and has given themselves magical properties, how can we stop them committing abuses, putting out hate speech or doing anything else? How can we stop them setting up a commercial entity that isn't really registered in any country but trades all over the world and doesn't adhere to any regulations? I think the risk with this is that Facebook and the other players create something that they say is almost ungovernable. And I think that could have very damaging consequences for society. And I think if there's an area where government and regulators really are going to struggle to keep up, it'll be the pace of development of the metaverse, when you can have one person like Ariana Grande doing a concert to 78 million people inside Fortnite. The scale of the potential, if you just charge them $2 each, the kind of commercial potential here leads to the potential for massive, massive abuse in that marketplace as well. So I think it's something we really need to be very mindful of. I'm also very mindful of the time.
I'm quite happy to give people at least a minute more each to make some concluding remarks.
Well, that was what I was going to do. Okay. So,
what have people found in the process of writing their chapter in this discussion? I wonder what each of the four of you have found as a surprise, something that wasn't quite what you expected. Was it something that helps you to see things differently, possibly from the discussion today? Or what have you heard maybe from government ministers that you weren't expecting to hear? What were they asking about? So there's a suggestion, maybe 1 minute each from each of you to have some concluding remarks, or anything else that you feel needs to be in the audience's mind.
Yeah, can we make that a real 60 seconds rather than an Indian one where the 60 seconds aren't necessarily connected?
Who wants to jump in first?
Jose, go on, I'll let you go first.
Well, I want to say that I feel actually very happy that the pandemic is getting over and that we have learned a lot in many different areas, and especially in health and medicine. That is why I want to say again, I believe this will be the last human pandemic, at least global pandemic in this style. And we will control many other diseases very soon because of the incredible advances in exponential technologies. So we live in the best times, but the future times will be even better. We have to be optimistic and work towards a better future.
Claire.
I would say I agree. I certainly believe in the power of hope. I believe in the power of the good people that they are, and the good people do outweigh the bad. And I believe that we can use this opportunity of this planetary consciousness in which we have been thrust. I have made so many new friends, spoken to so many conferences. I'm now going to also speak in a conference in Russia. I've also written a chapter in a book on geoethics and terraforming the moon. So I feel that together we can, and that's my message is to all of us. Let's just look for the best in ourselves, know that what you believe can be actualized, and therefore take care with the power of your word. Take care with the power of your word.
Excellent. Alejandro.
Well, I am an optimist. I don't believe that in dark dystopian scenarios, because I think that it's our responsibility as futurists to show that there are many ways and many combinations of the present that leads to a better world. And I don't think that the future is written. I think that we have to build it, and we have to be positive on that, and we have to think how to combine the present in order to make a better world. So that's my opinion, my way of thinking.
I just want to say thank you. Brian from Canada, you asked about how you regulate advertising companies when they're behaving perfectly legally. Let's pick that up in the discussion afterwards. If I was to add a closing thought, I'd say that what struck me about the book was both books really brought to me ideas that I would never have thought about, perspectives I would never have thought about, like, from the regeneration of the whole agricultural model coming out of Egypt, or a couple of different chapters about how you regenerate Africa, the Caribbean, the Pacific, and really ideas that would never have come onto my radar because I'm not in that context. And so understanding how they work together, and then novel ideas about food, about new scenarios for education. What struck me again was, as the others have pointed out, we are at a point where there is now breathing space for new ideas. There's space being created for radical ideas, radical possibilities, and no one can laugh at you in the way they might have done 5 years ago. Everything is worthy of some discussion, some consideration. And we are seeing some governments move faster than others in creating the time and space for these broader conversations. And that, to me, is a real source of optimism, because I still think that governments have a major role to play in shaping the direction of travel towards a more sustainable and inclusive future. I'm going to close there with just a reminder of the deal we are making for members of the London Futurist community. So the book is available from our website and from Amazon. And if you go to fastfuture.com and you use this code LF25, take a picture of the screen, you can get a 25% discount on this book, which is already ridiculously cheap, but also on any of our other books. So with that, I'm going to thank David for hosting us and hand back to him to close out the session. And obviously, thank you all for joining the session or watching it in the recordings afterwards.
Well, thank you, Rohit, for steering us through all this, keeping us to schedule. Thank you to Alejandro, to Jose, to Claire for diverse perspectives. Indeed, we need to appreciate things that weren't initially in our minds, and we get a lot wiser from seeing this alternative viewpoints. Thanks also to Doa for the video. In 3 weeks' time, London Futurists will be back at the same time, looking at something different, looking at some radical ideas for how we might accelerate living longer, healthier for everyone, by not just repairing damage, but by triggering mechanisms innate in biology, which can naturally deal with damage, And if we can figure out how to do that, and there are two speakers who think they have good ideas, then that's certainly worth discussing. So a different topic. We are not by any means at the end of this particular discussion. My notes are scattered all over 2 pages of things I want to follow up with. Rohit said he had lots of questions too. There is an option to come back here in 10 minutes. Don't go away. It's time for a bio break. It's time to recharge our coffees or anything else that we're drinking, or visit the toilet, powder our nose, make some trades in cryptocurrencies or whatever is desperately needed to do, buying or selling. You may go up as well as down, down as well as up. But I want to thank everybody again, and I'm going to close the recording now. Thank you.
Live long and prosper, my friends.